The bus ride from Calgary stretched longer than I expected. Cramped seats, stale air, and the smell of too many bodies packed into too small a space for too many hours. I'd spent most of the trip staring out the window as Alberta's landscape rolled by, watching city sprawl give way to farmland, then to scattered rural communities that barely qualified as towns. Clearwater wasn't even that, just a dusty intersection with a gas station, a diner, and a bus stop consisting of a metal bench under a weather-beaten awning. I grabbed my duffel bag from under the bus and stepped down onto gravel, squinting in the afternoon sun. "Joel Phillips?" a man's voice called from my right. I turned to see an older guy leaning against the hood of a mud-spattered pickup truck. He looked about 60 with short, gray-white hair poking out from under a faded baseball cap. His face was deeply lined, especially around his eyes, like someone who'd spent decades squinting into the sun. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. "Yeah, that's me," I said, walking over and extending my hand. "You must be Mr. Cunningham?" "Brandon," he corrected, giving my hand one firm shake before letting go. His palm felt like sandpaper. "Let's get going. Got about 40 minutes of driving ahead of us." He opened the driver's side door and climbed in without another word. I tossed my bag into the truck bed and got in the passenger seat. The interior smelled like old leather, coffee, and something earthy I couldn't quite place. Brandon started the engine and pulled onto the road. We drove in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "You ever worked a farm before?" "No, sir," I admitted, "but I'm a quick learner." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a grunt. "We'll see. Job's not complicated, but it takes consistency. You'll be handling the morning feeding for the livestock. Pigs, cattle, chickens. Maintenance work is needed, fence repairs, cleaning out stalls, that kind of thing." "Sounds straightforward enough," I said, watching the landscape slide by. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, broken occasionally by clusters of trees or distant farmhouses. "The work itself is," Brandon said, "but the farm has its quirks." I waited for him to elaborate, but he just kept driving, eyes fixed on the road ahead. After another few miles, he continued as if there hadn't been a pause. "You'll have Sundays off unless there's an emergency. Pays what we agreed on in the emails. You get your own cabin with basic amenities, electricity, running water, a small kitchen. Internet's spotty, but it works most days." "That's fine," I said. "I'm not much for social media anyway." Brandon nodded, seeming to approve of this. We turned off the main road onto a narrower one, then again onto what was little more than a dirt track. Trees began to appear more frequently on either side of us. "Farm's been in my family for generations," Brandon said. "It's not fancy, but it's good land if you treat it right." The truck crested a small hill, and suddenly the farm spread out before us. Fields of what looked like hay or alfalfa, a cluster of buildings, a large farmhouse, a big red barn, various outbuildings and sheds, pastures with cattle grazing, a pig pen visible off to one side. What caught my attention most, though, was the woods. Dense and dark, they pressed right up to the edge of the cleared farmland, creating a stark boundary between the open fields and what looked like impenetrable forest. Something about that hard line between civilization and wilderness made me uneasy. Brandon pulled up in front of the farmhouse and cut the engine. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying." I followed him past the main house to a small cabin set a little way back from the other buildings. It was simple but solid-looking, with a small porch and a single window visible from the front. "This is yours," Brandon said, fishing a key from his pocket and handing it to me. "Previous guy left about a month ago. Place has been cleaned since then." I took the key and followed him inside. The cabin was basic but comfortable. A main room with a kitchenette in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a worn but clean-looking sofa, and a wood stove. A door led to what I assumed was a bedroom, and another to a bathroom. Bedroom's through there, Brandon confirmed, pointing. Bathroom's got a shower. Hot water heater's small, so keep it quick. Kitchen's got the essentials. You'll need to stock your own food. There's a general store about 15 minutes down the main road. Got it, I said, setting my bag down on the table. When do I start? Tomorrow morning, 5:30. I'll come by to show you the ropes the first day. Brandon paused, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. There are some rules you need to follow while you're here. I took the paper expecting things like no smoking or quiet hours after 10. What I read instead made me look up at Brandon with raised eyebrows. The list was handwritten in neat blocky letters. 1. Always greet the pigs when you feed them. 2. Never sleep in the barn. 3. Don't name the cows. 4. If you see a man in the woods who looks like you, ignore him and walk away. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Hazing the new guy? Brandon's expression didn't change. His weathered face remained completely serious, eyes fixed on mine. No jokes. Those rules keep you safe here. Safe from what? I asked, a nervous laugh escaping me. Angry pigs? Just follow them, he said flatly. Every single one, no exceptions. The smile faded from my face as I looked at him. There wasn't a hint of humor in his expression, just a deadly seriousness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Okay, I said slowly, folding the paper and putting it in my pocket. I'll follow the rules. Brandon nodded once, apparently satisfied. Good, 5:30 tomorrow morning. Don't be late. He turned and walked out of the cabin without another word, leaving me standing there with the strange list in my pocket and a growing sense of unease in my gut. After the door closed behind him, I heard his truck start up and drive away. I was alone. I walked to the cabin's single window and looked out. From here, I could see the edge of the woods, dark and thick against the late afternoon sky. The farm buildings looked small and vulnerable against that wall of trees. What kind of place was this? What kind of farmer tells you to greet pigs and warns you about men in the woods? I pulled the list from my pocket and read it again, hoping it would somehow make more sense on a second reading. It didn't. I unpacked my few belongings, trying to settle in, but that sense of unease followed me around the small cabin. The isolation of this place was hitting me now. No neighbors within sight. No sounds except the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance and the wind in the trees. As darkness fell, the woods seemed to creep closer to my little cabin. I found myself checking the locks on the doors and pulling the curtain closed over the window. What had seemed like a straightforward farm job this morning now felt like something else entirely. I sat on the edge of the bed, wondering what I had gotten myself into. The job market had been tough, and this position had seemed like a godsend. Room and board included, decent pay, simple work. But now I wasn't so sure. Those rules kept playing in my mind. Always greet the pigs, never sleep in the barn, don't name the cows, beware the man in the woods. I told myself Brandon was probably just eccentric, as people who live in isolation often become. The rules were likely based on some personal superstitions, nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside and the occasional rustling from the direction of those dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this place, something I didn't understand yet, and I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to. I settled into a routine during my first week on Brandon's farm. Every morning I hauled myself out of bed at 5, splashed cold water on my face, and stumbled out into the gray dawn. The air felt different here than in the city, cleaner, sharper, carrying scents of hay and earth instead of exhaust and concrete. The livestock needed feeding before anything else. Brandon showed me the ropes on my first day, explaining the order. Pigs first, then cattle, then chickens. Animals know when their schedule changes, he told me. They don't like it. The pig pen sat about 50 yards from my cabin, a mud-filled enclosure surrounded by sturdy wooden fencing. Most of the pigs were ordinary enough, pink and grunting, rooting around in the dirt. But Kayla Brooks was something else entirely. She was massive, easily 600 pounds, with coarse dark hair and small eyes that tracked my movements with unnerving focus. The first time I saw her, I actually took a step back. "That's Kayla," Brandon said, nodding toward the enormous sow. "She runs the pen." I laughed, thinking he was making a joke. Brandon didn't laugh back. Each morning, I approached the pig pen with a wheelbarrow full of feed. Following Brandon's first rule, I called out, "Morning, pigs," feeling completely stupid as I dumped their food into the trough. The smaller pigs rushed forward, squealing and shoving, but Kayla always hung back, watching me with what looked like calculation in her eyes. After feeding the pigs, I'd head to the cattle pasture. Eddie, the old bull, was almost as unsettling as Kayla. He stood well over 6 feet at the shoulder with curved horns that looked like they could gore a man without effort. No matter where I worked, mending fences, clearing brush, hauling water, Eddie positioned himself to keep me in sight. He never came close, just watched from a distance, his massive head swinging slowly to track my movements. "Don't worry about Eddie," Brandon told me when he caught me staring back at the bull. "Long as you follow the rules, he won't bother you." I wanted to ask what would happen if I didn't follow the rules, but something in Brandon's expression stopped me. The rest of my daily tasks were straightforward enough: mucking out stalls, fixing equipment, patching fences. Brandon mostly left me alone, appearing occasionally to check my work or give new instructions. The work was hard but simple, and I fell into bed each night too tired to worry about strange rules or watching animals. On my 6th morning, I woke with a start, sunlight already streaming through my window. I grabbed my phone, 7:30. I'd overslept by 2 hours. "Shit," I muttered, jumping out of bed and pulling on my clothes. I yanked on my boots without bothering to lace them properly and ran outside. Brandon's truck was gone, which was a small mercy. Maybe he'd assumed I was already working and wouldn't notice my late start. I grabbed the wheelbarrow and raced to the feed shed, loading it with pig slop as quickly as I could. When I reached the pig pen, the animals were making a racket, squealing and pacing. They were hungry and unhappy about the delay. I hurried to dump their feed, my mind racing with excuses I could give Brandon if he questioned me. It wasn't until I was halfway to the cattle pasture with their hay that I realized I'd completely forgotten to greet the pigs. I stopped, wondering if I should go back, then shook my head. It was a stupid rule anyway. What difference could a greeting possibly make? I finished my morning chores in record time, then spent the day catching up on other tasks. Brandon returned in the afternoon but didn't mention my late start, which was a relief. That night, I fell asleep easily, putting the whole incident out of my mind. The next morning, I made sure to wake up on time. I headed out to the pig pen with their feed, calling out my usual greeting. The smaller pigs rushed forward as always, but something was wrong. One pig was missing from the usual crowd. I spotted it near the fence, a small pink pig lying motionless on its side. I set down the wheelbarrow and climbed over the fence, careful to avoid the mud. As I got closer, my stomach turned. The pig was dead, its neck twisted at an angle that made no sense. The head had been wrenched around almost completely backward, as if someone, or something, had grabbed it and twisted with incredible force. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet, and climbed back out of the pen. Kayla Brooks stood at the trough, watching me. The other pigs were eating, but she just stared, her small eyes fixed on mine. I found Brandon in the barn and told him about the dead pig. He followed me back to the pen, his face giving nothing away as he looked at the twisted corpse. "What do you think happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Some kind of animal attack?" Brandon shook his head. "No bite marks, no blood." He pointed to the ground around the dead pig. "No tracks either." "Then what?" "Looks like it broke its own neck." Brandon said flatly. I stared at him. That's not possible. Brandon looked at me, his weathered face serious. You follow all the rules yesterday? My throat went dry. I overslept. Was in a hurry. You greet the pigs? I couldn't meet his eyes. I forgot. Brandon nodded like this explained everything. Help me get this one out of here. We'll bury it behind the barn. We removed the dead pig in silence. As we walked away with the carcass, I glanced back at Kayla Brooks. She had moved to the fence and was watching us go, her eyes never leaving the dead pig we carried between us. That evening after dinner, I walked back to the pig pen alone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farm. The pigs were settling down for the night, grunting softly as they nestled into the mud. Kayla Brooks stood at the fence as if she'd been waiting for me. I felt ridiculous, but the image of that twisted pig kept flashing in my mind. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry about yesterday, I said quietly. I forgot to say good morning. It won't happen again. Kayla made a low, snorting sound that seemed to carry satisfaction. She held my gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked away, her massive body moving with surprising grace. A chill ran up my back. I had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that she had understood every word, that she had accepted my apology. I walked back to my cabin, feeling eyes on me the whole way. When I looked back at the pasture, Eddie stood at the fence, his dark form silhouetted against the sunset, watching me go. Something strange was happening on this farm. The rules weren't just eccentric habits of an old farmer, they meant something, and breaking them had consequences. I locked my cabin door that night, wondering what other rules I should be more careful about following. I worked late into the evening fixing a burst water line near the edge of the pig pen. The copper pipe had split from the previous winter's freeze and thaw cycle, Brandon told me, and needed to be cut out and replaced before the weather turned cold again. He'd showed me how to use the pipe cutter that morning, then left for town on a supply run. The sun dropped below the tree line as I tightened the last fitting. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, and my hands ached from gripping the wrench. I gathered the tools and straightened up, rolling my shoulders to work out the stiffness. That's when I heard it. A low moan came from inside the barn, faint at first, like the sound of wind pushing through a narrow space. I froze, listening. The farm had plenty of strange noises, but this wasn't the usual creaking of wood or the distant lowing of cattle. This was something else. The moan grew louder, building in intensity until it changed into something that made my skin crawl, a high, wavering shriek that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't a cow or pig. It wasn't even close to human. I turned toward the barn, my mouth dry. The large double doors stood partly open, revealing only darkness inside. The shriek cut off suddenly, leaving an unnatural silence that felt worse than the noise. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the growing darkness. "Brandon?" No answer came back. I set down the toolbox and dug my phone from my pocket, switching on its flashlight. The beam seemed weak against the deepening twilight. The rational part of my brain suggested a wounded animal had gotten trapped inside, but the rest of me knew better. I took a few hesitant steps toward the barn. Rule number 2, never sleep in the barn. Brandon had been clear about that one, but he hadn't said anything about not entering at night. "Is someone there?" I tried again, moving closer. The shriek returned without warning, louder this time, almost deafening. I jumped back, nearly dropping my phone. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing. I should go back to the cabin, lock the door, wait for Brandon. Instead, I found myself moving forward, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. I stopped at the barn entrance, shining my light inside. The beam caught dust motes floating in the air and illuminated the familiar layout. Stalls on either side, center aisle leading to the back, ladder to the hayloft. The hayloft! I tilted my light upward and my breath caught. Standing in the hayloft was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for any normal body. It stood motionless among the hay bales, a dark silhouette against the wooden wall behind it. My light caught it full on, but the figure didn't react, didn't move, didn't blink. But I felt it notice me. I can't explain how I knew, but in that moment, I felt its attention lock onto me like a predator spotting prey. There was hunger in that attention, ancient, patient hunger that had waited a very long time. I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on the figure. It remained motionless, but I sensed it watching me, tracking my movement. My foot caught on something, probably the toolbox, and I stumbled, nearly falling. When I looked back up, the figure had moved closer to the edge of the hayloft. I hadn't seen it move. It just was suddenly closer, its limbs bent at angles that looked wrong, painful. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, not caring about the tools I left behind. I sprinted across the yard toward my cabin, certain that at any moment I'd feel long, thin fingers closing around my neck. I slammed into my cabin door, fumbled with the key, and locked myself inside. I backed away from the door, watching the windows, half expecting to see that thin figure pressing against the glass. Nothing came. I sat on my bed, shaking. The clock on my nightstand read 8:45. Brandon might not be back for hours. I spent the night listening for sounds outside my cabin, any hint that the thing from the barn was moving around the farm. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle from the nearby trees sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke with a start at dawn, still fully dressed on top of my blankets. Morning light streamed through my window, making the previous night's terror seem distant, almost dreamlike. But I knew what I'd seen. I found Brandon in the kitchen of the main farmhouse, drinking coffee and reading a farming magazine. "There's something in the barn," I said without preamble. Brandon looked up at me, his weathered face giving away nothing. "What did you see?" I described the figure in the hayloft, the impossible height, the two long limbs, the way it had moved without seeming to move. Brandon nodded slowly, like I was confirming something he already knew. He took a sip of his coffee before speaking. "That's why you don't sleep in the barn," he said simply. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" I felt a surge of anger. There's some kind of, I don't know what, living in your barn, and all you can say is, "Don't sleep there." "What do you want me to say?" Brandon set his mug down. "That thing's been there longer than I have, longer than my father, and his father before him." "What is it?" "Don't know, don't want to know." He looked me in the eye. "It stays in the barn. We stay out at night, that's the arrangement." "Arrangement?" I sat down heavily in the chair across from him. "You have an arrangement with that thing?" "Not just with that one." Brandon's gaze drifted toward the window, where we could see Kayla Brooks watching us from the pig pen. "This farm has rules for a reason, Joel. They're not just odd ideas I came up with. They're warnings." I thought about the dead pig after I'd forgotten to say good morning. I thought about Eddie watching me from the pasture. I thought about the figure in the barn with its impossible limbs. "They're real," I said quietly. "All of it's real." Brandon nodded. "Now you understand." I did understand. The rules weren't superstitions or the quirks of an old farmer. They were boundaries, lines drawn between us and things that shouldn't exist but did, things that lived alongside us on this farm, watching and waiting for mistakes. "I'll get your tools from where you left them," Brandon said, standing up, "but next time leave the barn be after dark." I nodded, suddenly aware of how lucky I'd been. I'd backed away. I hadn't entered the barn fully. I hadn't broken the rule completely. Next time, I might not be so fortunate. I stood beside Brandon in the cattle pen, watching the laboring heifer with a mix of fascination and concern. The sun had barely cracked the horizon, painting the farm in soft pinks and oranges that did nothing to ease the tension of the moment. "She's been at it for hours," Brandon said, his voice low as he checked his watch. First-time mothers sometimes struggle. I nodded, trying to look like I knew what I was doing. Truth was, I'd never delivered a calf before. Growing up in Calgary hadn't exactly prepared me for this moment. There, Brandon pointed. See how she's laying down again? That's a good sign. Contractions are getting stronger. The heifer let out a low, pained moan that made me wince. What do we do if something goes wrong? I asked. Brandon gave me a sideways glance. We don't let it go wrong. He handed me a pair of plastic gloves that reached past my elbows, then pulled on his own pair with practiced efficiency. We waited another 20 minutes, Brandon occasionally checking the heifer's progress with gentle hands. I can see the front hooves, he said finally. That's good. Means it's coming out the right way. The next hour passed in a blur of focused activity. Brandon guided my hands, showing me how to help ease the calf into the world when the mother's pushes weren't quite enough. It was messy, exhausting work, but when the calf finally slid free in a rush of fluid and membranes, I felt a surge of something like pride. Clean its nose, Brandon instructed, already working to clear the mucus from the calf's mouth. I wiped the newborn's nose with a clean rag, watching in amazement as its chest expanded with its first breath. The calf was enormous, far bigger than I would have expected for a newborn. Wow, I said, stepping back to take in the size of it. That's one big baby. Brandon nodded as he helped the calf sit up. Good size. Strong, too. The mother cow was already turning to lick her calf, cleaning it with long strokes of her tongue. I watched as the newborn struggled to stand on wobbly legs, falling twice before managing to stay upright. Look at her go, I said with a laugh. She's built like a tank. Reminds me of Kayla. Maybe we should call her Kayla Jr. The words left my mouth before I could think about them. I'd meant it as a joke. The calf was unusually large like Kayla Brooks, the massive sow that ruled the pig pen. But as soon as I said it, I knew I'd made a mistake. Brandon's face changed instantly. The color drained away, leaving him ashen in the early morning light. His eyes darted to the calf, then back to me. What did you say? His voice was barely audible. I just meant she's big, like Kayla, I stammered, suddenly aware I'd broken one of the farm rules. Don't name the cows. It had seemed so arbitrary until now. Brandon turned away without another word, busying himself with cleaning up. The easy camaraderie we'd built during the birth had vanished, replaced with a tense silence that followed us through the rest of the morning chores. I tried to catch his eye several times to apologize or explain, but Brandon kept his distance. By noon, he'd left in his truck without telling me where he was going. I spent the rest of the day wondering what I'd done wrong. Sure, I'd broken a rule, but Brandon's reaction seemed extreme. I tried to put it out of my mind as I worked, telling myself it was probably nothing. 3 days passed in uncomfortable silence. Brandon spoke to me only when necessary, giving instructions about work that needed doing but nothing more. The calf seemed fine, growing stronger each day, though I made sure never to refer to it by any name again. On the morning of the 4th day, I headed out to check the cattle pasture fence line, a task Brandon had assigned me the evening before. The sun was bright overhead, warming my back as I walked the perimeter. Eddie, the massive bull, watched me from his usual spot near a cluster of trees, his dark eyes following my movements. I rounded a bend in the fence and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the tall grass about 20 yards inside the pasture, was something that didn't belong, something red and wet and wrong. My stomach turned over as I approached. It was the calf, what remained of it. The small body had been torn apart, chunks of flesh scattered across several feet of pasture. The grass was stained dark with blood, but strangely, the ground showed no signs of a struggle. No tracks, no drag marks, nothing to indicate what kind of animal could have done this. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice shaking. A soft snort made me look up. Eddie stood about 30 feet away, watching me with those unnerving eyes. I hadn't heard him approach, A 2,000-pound animal had somehow moved without making a sound. His gaze held mine, and I could have sworn I saw satisfaction there, a cold pleasure at my discovery. I backed away slowly, unwilling to turn my back on the bull. When I reached the fence, I slipped through the wires and jogged back to the farmhouse, my heart hammering in my chest. Brandon was in the kitchen when I burst through the door. "The calf," I said, out of breath. "Something got the calf." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once. "Show me." We walked back to the pasture in silence. When we reached the scene, Brandon knelt beside the remains, examining them with a detached professionalism that made my skin crawl. "No tracks," he said quietly. "No signs of predators." "Could it have been wolves? Coyotes?" I asked. Brandon shook his head. "Wolves leave tracks, and they don't have the strength to do this." He gestured at the way the calf had been torn apart. This was something else. He stood up and looked around the pasture. Eddie was nowhere to be seen. "We'll bury what's left," Brandon said. "Get the shovels from the barn." That evening, after we'd buried the calf's remains behind the barn, Brandon invited me into the farmhouse. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one across the table to me. "You named it," he said simply. I nodded, the guilt heavy in my chest. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," Brandon cut me off. "Names have power here. They create connections." "Connections to what?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Brandon took a long drink before answering. "To whatever sleeps in the barn, to the things in the woods. Names bind things together in ways we don't understand." I thought about Eddie watching me find the calf, that look of cold satisfaction in his eyes. "Eddie killed it, didn't he?" I asked. Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Eddie enforces the rules. So does Kayla Brooks. They're not just animals, Joel. They're guardians." "Guardians of what?" "Boundaries," Brandon said. "The rules aren't just superstitions. They're boundaries between us and things that shouldn't exist but do." I took a drink, welcoming the burn of the whiskey. "Like the thing in the barn." Brandon nodded. "That's why you don't sleep there. That's why you don't name the cows. That's why you always greet the pigs. And that's why you ignore anything in the woods that looks like you." I thought about the calf, how easily it had been destroyed, how there had been no evidence of what had done it. "The farm operates under rules you can't fully understand yet," Brandon continued. "Breaking them has consequences. Sometimes those consequences fall on the innocent." He looked at me pointedly. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I'll be more careful. With my words, with everything." Brandon seemed to accept this. "See that you are. Next time, it might not be just a calf that pays the price." Later that night, I lay in my bed in the cabin, replaying the day's events in my mind. The farm had seemed strange from the beginning, with its odd rules and boundaries, but now I was starting to see it for what it truly was, a place where normal rules didn't apply, where ancient forces operated just beneath the surface of everyday life. I was drifting towards sleep when I heard it, a soft, whispering sound coming from outside my window. I froze, straining to make out words in the hushed sounds. The whispers rose and fell like waves, sometimes seeming to form words just beyond my understanding, sometimes dissolving into meaningless noise. I didn't get out of bed to look. I didn't want to know what was making those sounds. Instead, I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and waited for morning, knowing the farm's mysteries were far from over. I hammered the last staple into the fence post, securing the wire mesh back in place. The old fence had been sagging for weeks, and Brandon finally pointed it out yesterday. Not that I needed the reminder. Eddie had been giving me the eye every time I walked past this section, like he knew it was a weak spot in his territory. The afternoon sun beat down on my back as I worked along the tree line. I'd been at it for hours, my t-shirt sticking to my skin. The woods loomed close here, the fence marking a clear boundary between the open pasture and the dense trees. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my forearm and reached for the hammer I'd set on a nearby stump. Something moved in the trees. I froze, hammer halfway to my hand. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a coyote, but the shape that stepped partially out from behind a thick trunk was unmistakably human. A man stood watching me from about 20 yards into the forest. He wore jeans and a dark t-shirt, and his build looked familiar. Too familiar. As he shifted his weight, stepping slightly forward, I felt my stomach drop. He looked like me. Same height, same build, even similar clothes to what I had on. The resemblance was so strong it felt like looking at a mirror, except for one crucial detail. His face seemed slightly off, like someone had tried to draw me from memory but got the proportions wrong. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the heat was getting to me. When I opened my eyes, he was still there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then he raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. His mouth stretched into what I guess was meant to be a smile, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp to be human. The smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained fixed on me with hungry interest. Without thinking, I raised my own hand and waved back. It was pure reflex, the kind of automatic response you give when someone greets you. The moment my hand completed the wave, I knew I'd made a mistake. The figure's smile widened impossibly, and he took a step forward. Then another. His movements were wrong, jerky and disjointed, like he was wearing a body that didn't quite fit. His knees bent at strange angles, his arms swung with mechanical precision, as if he were mimicking how humans walk without actually understanding the mechanics. "Shit," I whispered, backing away from the fence. The figure picked up speed, moving toward the fence line with that same broken gait. His eyes never left mine, and his smile never faltered. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I dropped the hammer, turned, and ran. My boots pounded across the pasture as I sprinted away from the woods. I didn't look back. Some deep instinct told me that would only make things worse. I just ran, my lungs burning, toward the distant shape of the farmhouse. I crossed the yard, jumped the 3 porch steps in one leap, and crashed through the front door. I slammed it behind me and turned the deadbolt with shaking hands. "Brandon?" I called out, my voice higher than normal. "Brandon?" No answer. I moved through the house quickly, checking rooms, making sure all the windows were closed. I ended up in the kitchen, my back against the refrigerator, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I'd just seen. Rule number 4. If you see a man in the woods who looks like you, ignore him and walk away. I'd done the exact opposite. I waited in the kitchen for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Every sound made me jump. The house settling, wind against the windows, the distant lowing of cattle. When I heard boots on the porch steps, I grabbed a kitchen knife from the block on the counter. The front door opened and Brandon's voice called out, "Joel, your truck's here, but the fence job isn't done." I set the knife down as Brandon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He took one look at me and his expression changed from annoyed to concerned. "What happened?" he asked, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "I saw him," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "The man in the woods. The one who... He looked like me, and I waved at him. I didn't mean to, it was just... He waved first, and I..." Brandon's face went pale. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a resigned look I was starting to recognize, the one that said I'd messed up again. "Sit down," he said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. I sat. My legs felt like they might give out anyway. Brandon moved to the cabinet above the sink and reached behind some canned goods. He pulled out a small wooden box I'd never seen before. "You waved at it," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't think, it was just automatic. I ran my hands through my hair. "What is that thing?" It looked like me, but wrong, and it moved like... "It doesn't matter what it is," Brandon cut me off. "What matters is what it wants." He sat across from me and placed the wooden box between us. It was about the size of a deck of cards, worn smooth with age and darkened with oil from years of handling. "That thing in the woods feeds on identity," Brandon explained, his voice low and measured. "It can only take someone's place if invited. Your wave was a partial invitation." I felt sick. "What does that mean, take my place?" "Exactly what it sounds like." Brandon opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded red fabric, was what looked like a small stone pendant on a leather cord. "It wants to be you, and once it takes your place, the real you disappears." He lifted the pendant from the box. It was dark gray with lighter streaks running through it, roughly oval-shaped with a hole drilled near the top where the cord passed through. "My grandfather gave this to my father, who gave it to me," Brandon said. "It's a protection. You need to carry it with you at all times now." He held it out to me. I took it carefully, feeling its weight. It was heavier than it looked and cool to the touch. "What does it do?" I asked. "It marks you as the original, makes it harder for that thing to mimic you completely." Brandon closed the empty box. "But it's not foolproof. That thing will try again. It's patient, and it's got nothing but time." I slipped the cord over my head, letting the stone rest against my chest under my shirt. "How do I know if it's working?" I asked. Brandon looked at me with those weathered eyes that had seen too much. "You'll know because you'll still be you tomorrow." He stood up and went to the window, looking out toward the woods. "You need to finish that fence before dark. I'll come with you." I clutched the stone through my shirt. "What if it comes back while we're out there?" "It won't," Brandon said with certainty. "Not today. It needs time to process what it learned from you. Your wave gave it a connection, a taste of who you are. It'll use that to get better at being you before it tries again." The thought made my skin crawl. "And when it does try again?" Brandon turned from the window. "Then you remember the rule. You don't acknowledge it. You don't speak to it. You walk away." He paused. "And you keep that stone with you. Always." I nodded, feeling the weight of the pendant against my skin. It felt like an anchor, the only thing keeping me from being erased by something I didn't understand. "Come on," Brandon said, heading for the door. "We've got work to finish." I followed him outside, squinting in the late afternoon sun. The farm looked the same as it always had. Barn, fields, animals going about their business. But now I understood that the normal appearance was just a thin veneer over something much darker. As we walked back toward the fence line, I caught Eddie watching us from his spot near the trees. His massive head tracked our movement, and for the first time, I was grateful for his vigilance rather than unnerved by it. The woods waited at the edge of the property, dark and still. I touched the stone pendant through my shirt and kept walking. I woke up to the feeling of being watched. Not the vague, paranoid kind of feeling, the real kind. The kind that makes the tiny hairs on your neck stand straight up. I sat up in bed and looked at my window. The curtain was drawn, but morning light leaked around its edges. Something moved outside, casting a brief shadow across the thin fabric. I got up, pulled on my jeans from yesterday, and approached the window. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw Kayla Brooks standing at the edge of the pig pen, her small eyes fixed directly on my cabin. She didn't move when I appeared at the window. She just watched. "Morning to you too," I muttered. I finished getting dressed and headed out to start my chores. The morning air felt cool against my skin, carrying the familiar farm smells of hay, manure, and wet earth. As I walked toward the pig pen with the morning feed, I noticed Eddie at the fence line of his pasture. He stood completely still, his massive head turned in my direction. The animals had always paid attention to me. I was their food source, after all, but this felt different, more deliberate, like they were studying me. "Morning, pigs," I called out as I approached the pen. The smaller pigs rushed forward, squealing and jostling for position, but Kayla held back, watching me with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. I dumped the feed and stepped back. "There you go." Kayla made a low grunt that didn't sound like her usual feeding noises. She kept her eyes on me as she finally moved forward to eat. After finishing with the pigs, I headed toward the cattle pasture. Eddie hadn't moved from his spot at the fence. As I got closer, I realized he was standing near one of the fence posts I'd repaired after my encounter with my look-alike from the woods. Something caught my eye on the post itself. I moved closer, cautious of Eddie's presence, and saw what looked like scratch marks in the wood, but they weren't random. They formed a pattern, 3 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash with a small circle at the intersection. I looked up at Eddie, who watched me examine the marking. "You do this?" I asked, feeling stupid for talking to a bull. Eddie just stared back, his eyes never leaving mine. I continued my walk along the fence line and found more markings on trees at the forest edge, similar symbols carved into the bark. Some looked fresh, with pale wood exposed beneath the cuts. Others seemed older, the edges weathered and darkened with time. I took out my phone and snapped pictures of a few different markings. They all shared common elements: lines, circles, diagonal slashes, but each was unique, like some kind of language. When I finished my morning chores and returned to my cabin for lunch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed on the farm. The animals' behavior, these strange symbols, it all felt connected somehow. That night I woke to scratching sounds outside my cabin. At first I thought it might be a branch scraping against the wall, but there were no trees close enough to touch the building. I lay perfectly still, listening. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It moved around the cabin from one wall to another. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs just outside my window. They rose and fell like waves, sometimes almost forming words before dissolving back into meaningless sounds. I pulled my blanket tighter around me and tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But I knew better. The wind didn't pause at windows, didn't make sounds that almost formed words. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I dragged myself out of bed and completed my chores mechanically, all the while feeling Kayla's and Eddie's eyes tracking my movements. After lunch, I found Brandon in the workshop, repairing a broken tractor part. I hesitated in the doorway, not sure how to bring up what I'd been experiencing. "Something on your mind?" Brandon asked without looking up from his work. I stepped into the workshop. I found some weird markings on the fence posts and trees by the forest edge, like symbols carved into the wood. Brandon's hand stopped moving. He set down his tools and looked at me. "I've also been hearing things at night," I continued. "Scratching on the walls, whispers outside my window." Brandon wiped his hands on a rag and gestured to a wooden stool. "Sit down, Joel." I sat while Brandon leaned back against his workbench, arms crossed. "My family has owned this land for 4 generations," he said. "My great-grandfather bought it in 1910. But the things that live here, they've been around a lot longer." "What things?" I asked. "The ones the rules protect you from." Brandon looked out the workshop door toward the barn. "This place sits on a boundary, not just between the forest and farmland, but between worlds." I waited for him to crack a smile, to tell me he was joking, but his expression remained deadly serious. "The animals aren't just livestock," he continued. "They're guardians. They watch. They enforce the rules. They maintain the boundaries." "Kayla and Eddie," I said. Brandon nodded. "They're special. They understand more than regular animals. They have a purpose here beyond providing meat or milk." "And what's in the barn?" I asked, remembering the impossibly tall figure I'd seen in the hayloft. Brandon's jaw tightened. "Something powerful, something that sleeps, and it needs to stay that way." "And the thing in the woods? The one that looks like me?" "It wants in," Brandon said simply. "It wants to wake what's in the barn. It's been trying for generations, using different tricks, different faces." The rules keep it at bay. I thought about the markings I'd found. And the symbols on the trees? Warnings, boundaries. Some were carved by my grandfather, my father. Others— Brandon hesitated. Others appear on their own. A chill ran up my back. What happened to the worker before me? Brandon looked down at his hands. He got curious, started testing the rules. The animals warned him, same as they warned you with the pig and the calf. But he didn't listen. What happened to him? He disappeared. Went into the barn at night with a flashlight. I found the flashlight the next morning, still on, lying in the middle of the floor. Never found him. I swallowed hard. And before him? Some left when they realized what this place is. Others— Brandon didn't finish the thought. I remembered the whispers outside my cabin, the scratching on the walls. So all this attention I've been getting, from Kayla, from Eddie, the noises at night, what does it mean? It means you're part of this now, Brandon said, whether you wanted to be or not. The boundaries are always weakest around new people. The things beyond the rules, they test you, try to find weaknesses. He walked to a cabinet in the corner of the workshop, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and pulled out a dusty leather-bound book. This belonged to a farmhand who worked here in the 1970s, he said, handing it to me. He kept a journal. Might help you understand what you're dealing with. I took the book. It felt heavy in my hands. The leather cover cracked with age. Read it if you want, Brandon said. Just keep following the rules. That night, I sat on my bed with the journal open in my lap. The handwriting was messy but readable. The entries dated from June to October 1978. The writer, someone named Thomas, documented his experiences on the farm, first dismissing Brandon's father's rules as superstitious nonsense, then gradually realizing their importance. The early entries were mundane, complaints about early mornings and hard work. But by August, Thomas was writing about strange noises, animals watching him, figures at the edge of the woods. His handwriting became more frantic as the entries progressed. September 12th. Something scratched at my door all night. The pig watched me all day. I think they know I'm planning to look in the barn tonight. September 13th. I couldn't do it. When I approached the barn after dark, all the animals were out. The cattle had somehow gotten loose. They formed a line between me and the barn. The pig stood in front. I went back to my cabin. The entries grew more paranoid, more frightened. Thomas wrote about seeing his own face in the woods, about symbols appearing on his cabin door overnight, about voices calling his name from the barn. The final entry was dated October 21st. I can't take it anymore. The whispering never stops. Last night, I saw my own face pressed against my window, but wrong somehow. The eyes too wide, the smile too big. No one will believe me. I have to know what's in the barn. Tonight, I'm going in, no matter what. If anyone finds this, tell Brandon's father I'm sorry. That was it. The remaining pages were blank. I closed the journal and set it aside, my hand shaking slightly. Thomas had disappeared after writing that entry. He'd broken the rules, ignored the warnings, and paid the price. I got up and checked my door was locked, then the windows. Outside, the night was quiet except for the occasional rustle from the direction of the woods. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help thinking about Thomas, about the worker before me, about all the people who had stood where I now stood. How many had tested the boundaries? How many had given in to curiosity? I touched the stone pendant that Brandon had given me, still hanging around my neck. It felt cool against my skin. The rules weren't arbitrary, the animals weren't just animals, and I wasn't just a farmhand anymore. I was part of whatever ancient arrangement kept the boundaries intact, kept the world separate. But as I drifted toward sleep, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered questions. What really was in the barn? Why did the forest creature wear my face? What would happen if I broke the rules just once, just to see? I pushed the thoughts away. but they lingered at the edges of my mind like shadows. And somewhere in the darkness outside, I heard a soft scratching begin again on my cabin wall. I'd had enough. Every night the scratching sounds grew louder, the whispers more insistent. The animals watched me with those knowing eyes, and Brandon's warnings hung over everything like a storm cloud. But what if it was all just some elaborate mind game? What if the real test was seeing how long I'd obey these crazy rules without proof? The thought had been growing all day while I worked, and by nightfall, I'd made up my mind. I was going to test the rules, just one, to see what actually happened. Not the one about the doppelganger in the woods. I wasn't that stupid. But the barn rule seemed safest. Whatever slept there hadn't bothered anyone who stayed out at night. If I could just spend one night inside, I'd know if these supernatural claims were real or just rural superstition. I waited until midnight. The farmhouse windows had gone dark hours ago, and the property lay silent under a moonless sky. I grabbed my sleeping bag from under my bed and tucked a flashlight into my jacket pocket. My heart pounded as I eased open my cabin door, wincing at every creak. Outside, the night pressed close. No moon meant the stars stood out sharp and bright, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of buildings. The barn loomed ahead, a black rectangle against the slightly lighter sky. I took a deep breath and stepped off my porch. The grass felt damp through my boots as I crossed the yard. Each step forward felt like moving through molasses, my body instinctively resisting what my mind had decided. The pendant Brandon had given me felt cold against my chest, even through my t-shirt. I reached up and touched it, wondering if I should take it off before entering the barn. No, that seemed like pushing my luck too far. One rule at a time. As I got closer, the barn took on more definition. The weathered wood, the slight gap between the double doors. I slowed my pace, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds of insects and distant wind. "This is ridiculous," I whispered to myself. "It's just a barn." I stopped about 10 feet from the entrance, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just complete silence pressing against my ears. My hand tightened around my sleeping bag. I took another step forward. A low, warning snort broke the silence behind me. I froze, then slowly turned around. My blood went cold. Every pig in the pen stood lined up at the fence facing me, not just Kayla Brooks, but all of them, arranged in a perfect row like soldiers at attention. Their eyes caught what little starlight there was, reflecting it back in an eerie glow. At the center stood Kayla, massive and still, her gaze fixed directly on me with what I could only describe as disappointment. "It's fine," I said, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing. "I'm just checking something." Kayla snorted again, louder this time. The smaller pigs remained motionless, watching. I looked toward my cabin, planning my retreat, and felt my stomach drop. Eddie the bull stood in the middle of the yard between me and safety. He pawed at the ground once, head lowered slightly, horns catching the starlight. How had he gotten out of the pasture? The fence had been secure when I checked it that afternoon. "Eddie," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, buddy." Eddie didn't move. He just watched me with those intelligent eyes, blocking the path back to my cabin. A loud crack from the direction of the woods made me jump, then another, the sound of branches breaking under heavy weight. Something large was moving through the trees at the edge of the property. I turned in a slow circle, the reality of my situation sinking in. The pigs at their fence, Eddie in the yard, something coming from the woods. I was surrounded by the farm's guardians, caught in the act of breaking the rules. The cracking sounds grew closer, and I squinted toward the tree line. A figure emerged from between two pines, stepping into the open field with jerky, unnatural movements. Even in the darkness, I recognized myself, or rather, the thing wearing my face. It had my height, my build, my general features, but everything was wrong. The eyes too wide, The smile stretched too far, the limbs moving at impossible angles. It wore the same clothes I had on, but they hung wrong on its frame, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. It raised one hand in that same deliberate wave I'd seen before, its smile widening to reveal teeth that looked too sharp, too white in the darkness. I clutched the pendant through my shirt, backing away from both the barn and my double. My back bumped against the pig fence, and I felt Kayla's breath hot on my neck. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to the animals or to Brandon or to whatever ancient arrangement I'd just threatened. "I'm sorry, I won't break the rules, I promise." The woods creature tilted its head at an angle no human neck should manage, studying me with hungry curiosity. It took another step forward, its movements smoother now, more natural, more like mine. "I'm leaving," I said louder, directing my words to Kayla Brooks behind me. "I'm going back to my cabin. I'll follow the rules." The massive pig snorted once, the sound somehow carrying finality. I edged sideways along the fence, keeping my eyes on my doppelganger. It matched my movements for a few steps, then suddenly stopped, its expression changing from hunger to frustration. Eddie shifted his weight, creating a narrow path between himself and the chicken coop, an opening for me to reach my cabin. I took it, moving slowly at first, then faster as I passed the bull. He turned his massive head to watch me but made no move to block my way. When I reached my porch steps, I looked back. The pigs had begun to disperse, moving away from their perfect line at the fence. Eddie ambled with surprising grace back toward the cattle pasture, though I had no idea how he would get back inside the fence he'd somehow escaped. The thing wearing my face remained at the edge of the yard, its outline already growing indistinct as it seemed to lose substance. As I watched, it stepped backward into the shadows beneath the trees, its form melting into the darkness until only its eyes remained visible, 2 points of light that finally winked out like stars behind clouds. I climbed the steps to my cabin on shaking legs, went inside and locked the door behind me. I dropped my sleeping bag on the floor and sat heavily on my bed, my heart still racing. Whatever was happening on this farm was real. The rules weren't restrictions, they were protection. And I'd nearly thrown that protection away because of stubborn curiosity. I lay down fully clothed, one hand pressed against the stone pendant. Outside, the night had returned to normal. I could hear crickets again and the distant rustle of leaves in the light wind. No scratching on my walls, no whispers at my window, just the ordinary sounds of a farm at night, for now. I woke up with sunlight streaming through the thin cabin curtains, feeling different than I had since arriving at the farm. Last night still felt like a fever dream, standing outside the barn with my sleeping bag, facing down the animals and that thing from the woods that wore my face. But the memory was too vivid, too real to dismiss. The pendant Brandon had given me rested cool against my chest under my t-shirt. I touched it through the fabric, drawing comfort from its solid weight. The rules weren't just superstitions or tests. They were protection, a shield against whatever ancient things lived on this land. I got dressed, pulled on my boots, and headed out to start my morning chores. The familiar routine felt different now. Each step across the yard carried new meaning. I wasn't just feeding animals, I was maintaining some kind of balance. When I reached the pig pen, I made sure to greet them properly. "Morning, pigs." My eyes found Kayla Brooks watching me from the back of the group. After last night, I couldn't see her the same way. She wasn't just a big sow. She was a guardian, standing between the farm and whatever waited beyond the boundaries. "Thanks," I added quietly, just for her. Her small eyes blinked once and she made a soft grunt that almost sounded like acknowledgement. The same feeling followed me to the cattle pasture. Eddie stood at the fence line, his massive head tracking my movements. I'd been afraid of him before, but now I felt something closer to respect. He'd blocked my path to the barn but left me an escape route back to my cabin. He wasn't threatening me. He was protecting me from my own stupid curiosity. After finishing my chores, I headed toward the farmhouse, surprised to see smoke coming from the chimney despite the mild morning. Brandon didn't usually have fires going this time of year. I knocked on the door and heard Brandon's gruff voice call, "It's open." Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee. Brandon sat at the table with 2 mugs in front of him, steam rising from both. He looked up when I entered, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Sit down," he said, pushing one of the mugs toward the empty chair. I took a seat and wrapped my hands around the warm mug. The coffee was black and strong, exactly what I needed after a night of fitful sleep. Brandon studied me for a long moment. "You went to the barn last night." It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "But you didn't go inside." "No," I said. "I couldn't. The animals wouldn't let me." Brandon nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "They were looking out for you, same as they've done for me and my family for generations." "What are they?" I asked. "Kayla and Eddie. They're not normal animals." "No," Brandon agreed. "They're guardians. Been here longer than my family has. They watch, they warn, they protect the boundaries." "Boundaries between what?" Brandon set down his mug. "Between our world and what lies beyond. This farm sits on a thin spot, a place where things can cross over if the boundaries weaken." I thought about the thing in the woods with my face, its impossible movements and too wide smile. And the rules keep the boundaries strong? "That's right." Brandon leaned forward, his eyes intent on mine. "You were tested last night, Joel. You've been tested since you got here. Every rule you've been tempted to break, every boundary you've thought about crossing." He smiled again. "And you passed. When it mattered, you respected the boundaries." The realization hit me. "Is that why you hired me? To test me?" Brandon shook his head. "I hired you because I needed help with the farm. The testing, that was them." He gestured vaguely toward the windows, indicating the farm beyond. "They test everyone who comes here. Most don't last." "Like Thomas?" I asked, thinking of the journal Brandon had given me. A shadow passed over Brandon's face. "Like Thomas. Got too curious. Thought he knew better than the rules." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Thomas's fate hanging between us. "There's something else I need to tell you," Brandon said finally. He took a deep breath. "I'm sick, Joel. Cancer. Doctor gave me 6 months, maybe a year." The news hit me like a physical blow. I'd only known Brandon a short time, but the thought of him not being here, not watching over this strange farm with its ancient secrets, left me cold. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling completely inadequate. Brandon shrugged. "It is what it is, but it means I need someone to take over as guardian when I'm gone, someone who understands what this place is, what it needs." I stared at him. "You want me to stay? To take over the farm?" "If you're willing," Brandon said. "It's a big responsibility, not just feeding animals and fixing fences. You'd be keeping the boundaries strong, keeping what's out there from getting in here." He tapped his finger on the table. "And keeping what's in the barn asleep," Brandon finished, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. I ran my finger around the rim of my coffee mug, thinking about what he was asking. A week ago I would have laughed at all this, ancient boundaries, guardian animals, things that shouldn't exist. But after what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, "What exactly sleeps in the barn?" I asked. Brandon shook his head. "I don't know its true nature. My grandfather didn't know either, nor his father before him. We just know it's old, older than this land, older than any of us, and it needs to stay asleep. And if it wakes up, then the thing in the woods gets what it wants." Brandon's eyes met mine. "And none of us want to see that happen." I nodded slowly, understanding more than I wanted to. The weight of what Brandon was offering settled on my shoulders. Not just a job or a farm, but a duty that stretched back generations. "I'll stay," I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. Not because I'm not scared of what's out there, but because I am. Because someone needs to keep watch. Relief washed over Brandon's face, softening the lines around his eyes. Good. That's good. He stood up, wincing slightly as he straightened. Then we've got a lot to cover before... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Over the next weeks, Brandon taught me everything he knew about the farm and its supernatural residents. We walked the property lines at dawn, Brandon showing me how to check for new markings on trees and fence posts. These symbols change with the seasons, he explained, running his fingers over a fresh carving on an old oak. They're stronger in spring and fall, weaker in summer and winter. The solstices are when the boundaries thin the most. Those nights, you need to stay up and watch. He taught me how to interpret the animals' warnings. Kayla's different grunts and movements, each with their own meaning. Eddie's positions in the pasture, how he would stand at the north fence when something stirred in the woods, or at the east fence when the barn needed watching. The chickens are your early warning system, Brandon told me one morning as we fed them. When they go quiet all at once, something's coming. When they get noisy for no reason, something's already here. We reinforced the boundaries together, Brandon showing me how to mix salt and iron filings into a paste that we spread on fence posts and door frames. This won't stop anything determined, he said as we worked, but it makes crossing over harder, more painful, gives you time to notice and respond. At night, Brandon would sit at his kitchen table with his father's journals spread before us, showing me records of boundary breaches, animal behaviors, and solutions that had worked in the past. My grandfather started keeping these records in 1915, he explained, turning yellowed pages carefully. First major incident was 1918, right as the Spanish flu hit. Boundaries weaken when there's widespread death or fear. I learned that the pendant I wore was one of 3 that Brandon's grandfather had made. The other 2 were lost, Brandon said. My father wore one. It disappeared with him the night he died. How did he die? I asked. Brandon's face grew tight. Protecting the boundary, something got through. Something big. Dad faced it down while my mother got me to safety. By the time we came back at dawn, Dad was gone, just the broken cord from his pendant lying in the yard. The reality of what I was taking on sank in deeper with each passing day. This wasn't just a job or even a caretaking position. It was a lifelong commitment to stand guard against forces I barely understood. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, Brandon and I stood at the edge of the property looking toward the darkening woods. You know, my grandfather used to say we don't own this land, Brandon said quietly. We just mind it. Keep the balance. I nodded, watching shadows deepen between the trees. I think I understand now. You do, Brandon agreed, better than most who've come here. That night, I lay in my cabin bed listening to the familiar sounds of the farm, crickets chirping, occasional animal movements, the soft rustle of wind through trees. No scratching at my walls, no whispers outside my window. The farm felt almost peaceful. But I knew better now. The peace existed because of vigilance, because of boundaries maintained through generations of careful watching, because of rules followed and respected. I touched the pendant against my chest, its weight now familiar and comforting. I was no longer just a farmhand who had taken a job out of desperation. I had become something more, a guardian of the space between worlds, a keeper of ancient boundaries. And as I drifted toward sleep, I felt something I hadn't expected to find on this strange farm. Purpose, a reason to stay, to watch, to protect. Not in spite of the supernatural dangers that surrounded us, but because of them. Because someone had to stand between our world and what waited beyond the boundaries. Someone had to keep what slept in the barn from waking, and now that someone was me.